He was born in Ireland, but he grew up in America. So he's this kind of what we would call hybrid identity. He sees himself as Irish, but also American. And he's writing a letter back to one of the young members of his family, and he's trying to describe the military situation in Virginia, where his regiment is based. And he says to him, "We are playing ball here at present. I am the hinder." I'm not sure what that actually means, but he says, "We have pitchers and plenty of catchers. The home base is Suffolk or Richmond. Fanny and Matt, who are two friends of his, are the fielders, and Mikey Corcoran, who's his general, holds the bat. Ben Conlon holds the grub, and your uncle nabs all the bad players up in the guardhouse." So he's talking to his young nephew, who's like, in single digits, and he's describing the military situation and what the Irish Legion are doing in terms of a baseball game. So that's a guy who baseball is the quintessential American sport, as you know. So it shows you the degree to which that guy sees himself as Irish and American at the same time.
That was Damian Shiels, author of the book Green and Blue, Irish Americans in the Union Military, 1861 to 1865, Conflicting Worlds, New Dimensions of the American Civil War. Hello and welcome to episode 109 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. March is Irish American Heritage Month in the United States. The Civil War was the first major chance for the Irish to prove their allegiance to their new home. Damian Shiels is my guest on the show today, and he'll share some of the first-hand stories that make up his amazing book. Let's get right into our conversation. Thanks for being here, Damian.
Thanks a million for having me on, Rick. I appreciate it.
So this is something that fascinates me, is how we talk about on the Irish Baseball Podcast a lot about how the Irish used baseball as a way to ingratiate themselves into the larger American society, that baseball was a job that Irish immigrants, first, second generation Irish people could get this job, and it would give them a certain amount of notoriety. It would give them a certain amount of exposure that made them feel more American. Well, I think the one place where this happened maybe more than baseball was in the Civil War, because I don't think people realize exactly how many Irish and Irish Americans fought in the Civil War. Would you say that through your research, this is one of the ways that the Irish really started to feel American?
Yeah, that's true, Rick. It's kind of there's a two-part answer to that, I suppose. So you were talking about the numbers who fought. Like, one of the things, and I discussed it in my book, is we've been underestimating the number of Irish who fought in the Civil War actually for a long, long time. We had to do a new analysis of it. Like, you'd read in a lot of books about how the Irish were actually underrepresented, because, as we know, there were so many Irish in the United States at that time. 1.6 million Irish-born people were living in America when the Civil War broke out. Like, colossal. 1 in every 4 people in New York City had been born in Ireland at the start of the Civil War. Like, these are gigantic, and New York, of course, is very important for baseball. But like, I was keen to look at them across service, and what you see is you see some of these new immigrants who are very keen to kind of show their commitment to the United States. But one of the other things you see is a lot of these Irish people who feel that they're already American. They're already part of the United States when the war breaks out. And so they're really keen to do their duty by their country. And we'll have to get to it, because we'll discuss some of the work I was doing. But one of the quotes I actually use in the book from a letter I found to actually demonstrate that point of how they viewed themselves as American as well, actually is a quote about baseball from the Civil War. So it ties it all in together.
Oh, well, I have to hear this one then. So why don't you tell me about this quote right now?
Yeah, well, it's a guy now, and as I was saying to you when we were corresponding over this, I'm a very novice baseball person. I've only just started kind of getting into it, so even my knowledge of the rules and everything have only just come on recently. But this was a 19-year-old guy who served in, everybody's heard of the Irish Brigade, right? Thomas Francis Meagher and the Irish Brigade. there was one other brigade that was ethnically Irish in the US military at the time, and that was Corcoran's Irish Legion, the Irish Legion. A lot of really dedicated Irish Fenians and things were in that unit. But one of the guys in it, he was a sergeant in one of the regiments in that. He was 19 years old. He was born in Ireland, but he grew up in America. So he's this kind of what we would call hybrid identity. He sees himself as Irish, but also American. And he's writing a letter back. He's what we call partially literate. So he's not able to write very well. So it's very hard to read his letter. It's really difficult because he spells phonetically and it's kind of all over the page and everything. But he's writing back to one of the young members of his family, and he's trying to describe the military situation in Virginia where his regiment is based. And he says to him, "We are playing ball here at present. I am the hinder." I'm not sure what that actually means, but he says, "We have pitchers and plenty of catchers. The home base is Suffolk or Richmond. Fanny and Matt, who are two friends of his, are the fielders, and Mikey Corcoran, who's his general, holds the bat. Ben Conlon holds the grub, and your uncle nabs all the bad players up in the guardhouse." So he's talking to his young nephew who's in single digits, and he's describing the military situation and what the Irish Legion are doing in terms of a baseball game. So that shows you that's a guy who baseball is the quintessential American sport, as you know. So it shows you the degree to which that guy sees himself as Irish and American at the same time.
No, that is such a great piece of history that you found there. And I think that's one of the things about your book that is so interesting is this isn't, going through as much newspapers and you're going through letters from these Irish American soldiers and seeing how they viewed the actions of the Civil War, how they viewed their role in society in this conflict. So how important do you feel it is to go right straight to the horse's mouth like that?
Oh, it's really important, Rick. And that's kind of, it is the crux of the book. I kind of start by trying to do a reanalysis of how many fought and where they fought and who they fought for and all of this. But you wouldn't think it because there's so much about the Irish Brigade and everything. But one of the big problems we've actually had for looking at the Irish in the Civil War is that they didn't leave letters behind, a lot of them. Officers did, right? So, guys, but there's very few of the ordinary enlisted guys coming out of Manhattan or the 5 Points or wherever it is, coming out of Philly or Boston, who actually, because a lot of them are illiterate, but very few of them actually leave behind letters. And I wanted to try and tell that story. So I spent nearly 15 years going through one source. It's called the Widow's Pension Files. They're all in the National Archives there on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. And these are the applications of mothers and the widows of men who died in the Civil War. And these people often had a hard time proving to the government that, they were, married or it was their son, or, sometimes Irish guys didn't serve under their real names and they had to prove who it was. And so what they did was sometimes, occasionally, they put in original letters that were sent to them by the soldier. And so James Livingston, who we were just talking about there with the baseball, James Livingston's letters survive because he was mortally wounded in action at the Battle of Cold Harbor in 1864. And his mother handed in the letters to show that he had, in another part of that letter, he says that, I'm sending you $5. And it proved to the government that he supported her. And so within those letters, they're talking about everything. They're talking about why they enlist, about their identity, about the experience they have, about their relationships with, slavery or whatever, how they viewed that, what they thought about going into battle, who they spent their time with in the army. And it's one of the other kind of important things, because we tend to just think about the Irish Brigade and things like that. There were in and around 250,000 Irish Americans served in the United States military in the Civil War. About 180,000 of them were born in Ireland, and about 70,000 were the children of Irish immigrants. But So I wanted to expand it beyond just the Irish Brigade and things like that. So we ended up like that. There's over 270 different units, 395 soldiers represented in over 1,100 letters. So, and it just tells you everything about their lives and why they're enlisting and the things, why would they desert and all that sort of stuff.
So I know that one of the pieces of propaganda used by the Confederacy at the time was to say that, oh, the North is fighting for freedom for blacks. But if you look at how the Irish are treated in the North, it's not much better. They might be making a few cents a day, but they're still basically living in slavery conditions. Do you find that as you look through these letters that these Irish Americans, these Irish immigrants really felt that they were fighting for the right cause in the North? Were they susceptible to that propaganda? And did they see this more as, what Lincoln was preaching at the time, which was preserving the Union and saving their new country? How did that, use of propaganda, like I said, from the Confederacy impact those Irish soldiers, or didn't it?
Yeah, well, and not only it's coming from Irish Confederates as well. There's a very famous Irish Confederate called John Mitchell, who had been he'd been part of the Young Ireland Rebellion. Actually, Thomas Francis Meagher and him knew each other as part of that. And Mitchell viewed in very much those terms. He felt, the kind of wage slavery that a lot of Irish were experiencing in the North was terrible. He moved south, like Mitchell was a big proponent of the Confederacy. Two of his sons actually died fighting for the Confederacy. And he was addressing the Irish specifically, saying this. But when you look at the Irish service and they serve like over their proportion of the population, right? So, and you have to think about it. They don't like Abraham Lincoln, the Irish Americans. They don't like the Republican Party and they tend not to like abolitionists either. They're all very complex reasons behind that. But one of the big things was like they would have associated the Republicans with being anti-immigrant, anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, right? Which is a big deal in that time. And so they're Democrats in the North, the overwhelmingly Democrats, the rank and file of the army. And the Democrats, as we know, had a kind of a bit, they didn't go to war in relation to slavery. And the Irish, you can't generalize when you have 250,000 men, but to generalize a bit, the vast majority of them are going for two reasons. There are two reasons that they serve, and that is the preservation of the Union of the United States of America, their country, because they saw it as a huge threat, the Confederacy trying to rip the country apart. And economics does play a role in it then as well. And often they're kind of mixed in with each other. It's very rarely one or the other, but they're the kind of two primary drivers. And so, and there's a very good book by a guy called Professor Gary Gallagher. Like, he's a really good Civil War historian. He writes a book called The Union War, and he shows the degree to which the Union was what was really important. It's kind of harder, I think, for us to understand today that concept that they had of its importance for them. But it's hugely motivating for Irish guys and some guys who are just literally off the boat. Like, I have guys who arrive in the middle of the war and they're talking about this, that they need to preserve the American Republic and to kind of stop, that there was a counter argument that you could put where the Irish did do this, where you would look at the kind of planter class in the South and go, well, that's very similar, isn't it, to the British landlord class back in Ireland? Like, this kind of structure in a society, we don't want that, do we? And so that was the kind of counter argument that a lot of guys in the North put forward. But in the book, I think with the numbers that serve, you can see that it didn't work, that argument that the South had, because why are they all serving, like, to that degree, when, as I say, they don't like so many things about Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, and they don't really want equality with African Americans either, because they see it as an economic threat. And so you've got this scenario where even with all that, they're still serving in these massive numbers, and that's really down to preserving the United States, preserving the Union.
And I think when you talk about this, I'm sure a lot of our listeners know, but it's worthy of a reminder that the Republican Party was so new at the time that these members, the high profile members of the Republican Party, were coming from the Whigs, but also some other parties. And some of those secondary parties that weren't the Whigs were extremely anti-immigrant and extremely, on top of that, anti-Catholic. So while it's easy to look back in hindsight and be like, well, how could they not like Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah.
A lot about the company with which he surrounded himself was a lot of times very, very anti-Catholic. I know I'm from Lancaster, Pennsylvania originally, and we had the great Representative Thaddeus Stevens, and, you know, we praise him a lot because very, very progressive in one way. And he did very much see black people as being equal to white people. But he was, you know, in his earlier days, he was not a fan of Catholics coming from European countries and, you know, bringing that aspect. So it is a good point that you make when you talk about how these immigrants and these second generation Irish would view this new party that took over.
Yeah, like as you alluded to there, like there was that party in the 1850s called the Know Nothings. So Lincoln is the first Republican president, but the Know Nothings, and like it's not all the Know Nothings, but certain numbers of the Know Nothings go into the new Republican Party, and the Know Nothings were like virulently anti-Catholic. I mean, they just did not, and there had been the rise of the Know Nothings was relatively brief, but it was in the 1850s, so it's, you know, it's not very far from the Civil War, and it's big in cities where the Irish are in large numbers, you know, so the likes of New York, by far the biggest, and Philly is the second, and then on down through the list. And so like they see that, and the Democrats were the ones who said, oh, hang on, the Irish are a good vote here. We'll start to nurture them along. And I just, we look back in things now, and it is, you know, I'm a big fan of Lincoln, like, but you look back now, and it's very easy, I think, in hindsight, to look at these things in a very kind of a black and white version of events. There's the good people and there's the bad people, but things are a lot different, particularly if you're somebody who's really living on the margins of society, like white working class urban people were in these cities. Like their living conditions could be really challenging. You're consistently concerned about your next wage. A lot of these guys are day laborers, you know, so they're going, and every day they have to go and try and find new work. They're living in rented accommodation, so like they never have a huge amount of stability, a lot of them, in their lives, and obviously their primary concern is for their own future and that of their families. And so, like, yeah, I maybe doesn't get spoken about enough how many of the abolitionists were very, very anti-Catholic. so there are like significant numbers. So, you know, that's not going to make Irish immigrants who are there big fans. And as I say, there was the threats, and it did lead. And I mean, I discussed this in the book. Like, there is no question about it. The Irish were not very good when it came to race relations with African Americans. They were fairly of one view whenever they referenced African Americans in their correspondence. But interestingly, it doesn't appear to have impacted them. After the Emancipation Proclamation came in, they're still enlisting in the military. They're still staying in the military even after that. So, yeah, it's a complicated story.
This is just the beginning of my conversation with Damian Shiels, author of the book Green and Blue, Irish Americans in the Union Military, 1861 to 1865, Conflicting Worlds, New Dimensions of the American Civil War. I'm your host, Rick Becker, and I will have Damian back on the show next month to take even more of a look at the stories of individual Irish and Irish American soldiers who laid down their lives in the Union Army. We have a very busy summer coming up at the Irish American Baseball Society, the Irish Wolfhounds, the Irish American Baseball Hall of Fame, Irish Nights, both official and informal gatherings at professional ballparks, and so many other events and announcements will be happening that you have to make sure you're following the IABS on social media. Every like, share, positive comment, and every time someone shows up for in-person support, we make a statement about the strength of our group. This has been episode 109 of the Irish Baseball Podcast.